site. Yeah. So I think people will still be slowly gathering, so we don't rush this too much. Okay. But I'll start anyhow, hoping that people will just come slowly. So welcome to everyone from Estonia. And as I mentioned already, today is a day of knowledge here, which is the day when children go to school and people tend to probably celebrate knowledge rather than acquire it, or learning rather than necessarily join events like this. I know there is a small number of Estonians registered, so hopefully they will be joining, at least some of them. But it's definitely a pleasure to see so many participants from all over Europe and maybe even further afield here at our Cost Action Working Group 1 first webinar, Cost Action Shift webinar, which is titled Public Engagement and Climate Action, Consensus versus Agonistic Processes. And we are hoping to discuss such democratic processes as citizens and people's assemblies, and on the other hand, environmental activist movements, which are all definitely sort of very valuable manifestations of agency of change for change, but they are also somewhat controversial or contradictory. So we hope to engage in understanding how these seemingly contradictory practices can merge, how they provide new spaces for dialogue, for deliberation, for experimentation, and arrive at some sort of synergy. And at this point, let me turn to our speakers, one of whom, John Barry, is already with us. And unfortunately, we have to announce that with great sadness that Clodagh Harris, who was going to be our second speaker, contacted us to say she had an eye injury and cannot contribute. So with this quite unexpected change, we had to shift things around a little, and our own Alexandra Reves is going to step in. Also, she has worked with Clodagh and hopefully can represent some of the views and approaches that Clodagh would have brought to the table had she been able to join us. But allow me to briefly introduce our speakers, and they can probably correct me if I'm getting anything wrong, but what I could gather, John Barry is a professor of green political economy in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University Belfast. And I also understand you're a recovering politician, so maybe you will briefly explain what that includes. John has a fascinating list of research interests, which is too long to include fully here, but it includes green moral and political theory, post-growth political economy, politics and policy of climate breakdown, policy action and engaged research, as well as greening of citizenship and civic republicanism. And John leads quite a number of projects and networks, and is most certainly a truly inspiring and invigorating speaker who I have had the honor of hearing on a couple of occasions on various Zoom events. And Alexandra is a research fellow at Mare and is located in the Environmental Research Institute in University College Cork. And her expertise is in such diverse areas as societal and policy aspects of climate action, disaster management, and energy transitions. And Alexandra is also involved in a variety of projects, which are exploring, for example, the public engagement with energy transition and the impact of the arts in climate action in Ireland. And Alexandra, many of you are from Shift Cost Action as well, so you already know, but for those of you who have joined from other institutions, Alexandra is the vice chair of our Cost Action Shift. Shift stands for Social Sciences and Humanities, for Transformation and Climate Resilience. Now, before giving the floor to our speakers, a couple of housekeeping points. As you already know, the session is recorded, and the recording is made available at Shift website. But for our record keeping, please make sure that you have your name, a recognizable name, visible, and if you have enrolled with a nickname or some sort of shorter version, please change it to your full name. So with this, let me welcome John Barry. I made you already co-host, so you'll be able to show the slides, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Can somebody just tell me if you can see my slides there?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Well, so hello, good morning, and welcome over an extremely raining Northern Ireland where I am. So I'm delighted to be with you here today. And what I'm going to give you is less probably a formalized paper than a series of provocations, because I think we all need it on a Friday morning to wake us up. So I'm essentially going to talk about what I see as the, I suppose, clash now of two forms of turbulences that we can already see playing out in societies and indeed globally. One, of course, is the hastening planetary crisis. I mean, this summer, if anything else, has accelerated, I think, certainly scientists I've been speaking to, that things are beginning to develop in terms of heat waves, extreme weather events, the devastating wildfires in the Mediterranean and in North America and Asia. Things are getting worse much more quickly than the scientists had predicted. But we're also seeing, could everybody ensure that your microphones are turned off? I'm hearing. Sylvia, could I ask you to? Thank you. Apologies. So yeah, there's one form of turbulence, not necessarily digital interruption like that, but that is one sort that we have to deal with. So we have to continuing, if you like, planetary crisis. Now quickening and moving much quicker than the scientific models have predicted, but also up against that now we have increasing political turbulence in terms of the weaponization, the cultural wars are now being played out around the climate crisis. And I'm going to touch upon some of those, but particularly to recognize the importance that social conflict is inevitable around the climate and ecological crisis, and therefore sustainability transitions. And actually it can be seen as healthy. And what we need to do is not try and quash contestation, but actually find ways of including that in a productive manner, because essentially what I'm going to argue is, and this is partly on my experience here as a recovering politician, I was a former leader of the Green Party here in Northern Ireland, and for 7 years I was a local municipal councillor. But in Northern Ireland, we're a post-conflict society, and I do think that there are lessons to be had from the transition of societies like mine from war to peace to some post-conflict situation, that we can learn lessons in terms of conflict transformation in ideas such as the just transition, which I think are a great term, a great idea and policy, but too often the just transition presents a lazy and naive win-win-win scenario. There will be winners and losers, so therefore we're going to have conflict, so we need to recognize that and find ways of productively working with those who oppose sustainability transitions and trying to win them over in terms of using institutionalized and other forms of democratic engagement. But sadly, I think this is the situation our situation is in. Just going back to this summer that we've seen and the extreme weather events, which of course are not just weather events. I mean, it goes without saying that these are now going to produce food shortages, as we've already seen in supermarkets, certainly in parts of England and Ireland earlier on this summer because of the extreme heat in places like Spain and Morocco. But then right up to issues which are going to increase in the future of people displaced because of climate-related disasters. And where are they going to go? I mean, what was interesting for me during the very big media coverage we had here, certainly in Britain and Ireland, of those mostly British, Irish, and basically rich world people who are caught up in those wildfires in Corfu and Greece and Rhodes, they were temporary climate refugees in a way, those people. But actually against that backdrop that we have hundreds of thousands of more people who are already climate displaced around the world, but we don't get as much media attention. And I do think that issue of forced climate migration is going to be a major challenge in the decades ahead. So just an overview of what I want to talk about. Again, I mentioned already the importance of seeing democracy, I think, as a form of a non-violent disagreement, that I think consensus, while valuable, often should take a second place to contestation, which is something that we, for those of you who are academics or in the academy, I mean, this is a normal part of our world where we look forward to debate, disagreement, and argument, as we will probably have today. Well, also, I think that can also be seen as productive in the political sphere. It does become an issue, as I'll point out, is where agonism, so, you know, disagreement between people who hold different views, but they view each other as opponents, when that agonistic relationship of disagreement begins to come over into violence, which is basically where you have enemies. So enemy friend as opposed to opponents in a debate. And I do think we have to be aware of the potential of violence as we begin this transition away from carbon energy. I would also say away from orthodox economic growth. And indeed, as part of that, a movement away from what we now would see as the dominant economic order of capitalism. And it is this question, I think, of the coming decades of political instability coming up against the planetary turbulence is going to be the major issue of the Anthropocene, as we now call it. So democracy is non-violent disagreement. The reality is it's already here. These are images. The one on the left is from the Netherlands, where some of you may know there's been this massive growth of a new farmers' party, essentially challenging a lot of climate legislation that they see as being disproportionately negative for the farming community. And we get it also being played out where I live in Ireland. So the image on the right is a kind of a mirror of what's happening in the Netherlands. And indeed, as those of you who are listening in from the island of Ireland might know, there's serious talk that we have an election coming up in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland next year. And there's talk of a farmers' party, which I could see, if it does develop, will probably be on the model of the Dutch anti-climate farmers' party that we've had. So in other words, it's not as if conflict is somehow happening in the future, and the climate is already right here, right now. And indeed, it's only going to increase, particularly because this is now an ideological battle for hearts and minds, particularly on the island of Ireland. And the reason why I stress farming is that, with the exception maybe of the Netherlands, the island of Ireland is unique in that our biggest challenge in the transition away from, you know, our overuse of carbon and other forms of greenhouse gas producing practices is not necessarily in energy or transport, although they are important. It is in farming. You know, over 40% of the Republic of Ireland's greenhouse gases come from our beef and dairy herd. It's about 25% here in Northern Ireland where I live, but that is huge in the European context, where it's usually transport or electricity or energy production is where the major challenges are. And already we see on the island of Ireland a similar debate that happened in the Netherlands of farmers claiming that climate change is going to, cause them immeasurable harm in terms of the culling, as you say here, of 200,000 cows. It's rather ironic, given that these cows are going to die anyway, particularly in the beef sector. But the issue is that there's going to be a direct threat to a farming way of life in Ireland. And you can already see how it's being weaponized, you know, Ireland's bonkers plan. So the science is really clear that, you know, if you want to get protein, you know, beef and dairy are incredibly wasteful of water, greenhouse gas production, never mind the animal rights issues around this. But of course, those defending the status quo want to portray climate-informed policies as, in this case here, bonkers. And it's a kind of an indication, I think, of the culture wars, the political battles that we're going to see ahead, certainly in Ireland and elsewhere. And we do see non-violent reaction. You know, farmers have taken to the streets, for example, but we've also had, here's a quote from, you know, Martin Luther King, in that those who have engaged in non-violence around the climate issue are simply bringing to the fore these tensions that already exist in society. And we certainly see this in many countries, such as, Just Stop Oil in Britain. This is a young activist who disrupted a snooker tournament and got a lot of publicity. We've also seen Indigenous peoples. This is an image from the Standing Rock anti-oil pipeline struggle in North Dakota in America. And Extinction Rebellion here on the bottom, Rebel for Life, which of course is now indeed in the academy, where you got Scientist Rebellion and academics, including me, who now see themselves as activist academics because of the lack of, change that we see in our governments. But as well as the non-violence, we also have to recognize there is a growing, at least academic debate, and I think there are discussions in parts of the climate environmental movement, particularly informed by the Swedish eco-Marxist scholar and activist Andreas Malm, and some of you may know of his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which has now become a movie. I am not advocating violence, colleagues, at all. Please don't think that I am. I'm just saying that looking descriptively, analytically at what's happening in the climate movement, you can see how people's frustrations, where they've engaged in lobbying their politicians, they've voted for a Green Party, or they've engaged in non-violent direct action, they've tried to influence liberal governments to make changes, and then nothing happens, or actually something quite regressive happens, as recently did here in the UK, where the Prime Minister, on the one hand, says that Britain wants to become a leader in the net zero transition, and then issues 100 new licenses to explore oil and gas off the North Sea. So you can see against that background that some elements of the climate movement, citizens who are concerned about their children's future, and indeed I would have to admit that that's what motivates me now in a lot of my work politically and academically. I've got 2 children, and I'm absolutely terrified for their future, given how I see the science is now under predicting the changes that are happening that we see already. The governments, whether it's in the Republic of Ireland, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere, are not moving at the pace and scale that is necessary. We are not seeing one sliver, if you like, of hope in terms of these magical technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, of which there's a lot of attention on. And you could see how that frustration, concern, and I suppose really, to put it in political theory terms or political terms, for some people, the government has broken the social contract. The first rule of any government, the first job of any government is to protect its people. And in failing to move at pace and scale on decarbonising, on moving away from an oil, gas and coal-based economy, on engaging in changes to the structure of the economy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including in sectors like agri-food and land use, as I mentioned already, you could see how that might lead some people to say, well, the government has broken the contract. I now have a right to rebel. And that rebellion may be non-violent in terms of street protests or occupation, but you could see how some people may start engaging in other forms of violent protest because of the failure of government action. And injustice, I think, is at the heart of sustainability and unsustainability transformations, in terms of what will be familiar to many of you, particularly if you're doing politics or political theory or philosophy. The 3 forms of justice we can talk about: distributive, material, procedural. Do you have voice in the process? And recognition, is your identity and your cultural norms represented in the process? And across all of these 3, I think are useful ways of analytically understanding the issues of justice at stake in maybe very specific local or nationally specific forms of energy and sustainability transitions. But conflict, and indeed conflict transformation, I think, is something that we're going to have to integrate more into our thinking around sustainability transitions, particularly because there's dispute often about the causes of the crisis, of the planetary crisis, the consequences, which are very unevenly distributed within societies and between societies. And of course, there's a big debate around the responses. I've already mentioned or indicated there my skepticism around technological solutions to these crises, particularly the amount of money that governments are pulling into, solar radiation management analyses and research, and as I say, carbon capture and sequestration, for which there is no empirical evidence at all that can be developed at cost, at pace, and at scale, to the extent that we can include it as a reasonable and realistic part of the tools that we're going to need going forward. So across the causes, the consequences, and the solutions, we have a lot of debate and a lack of consensus. And that's why, and I'm offering here what I call a green or civic Republican idea. So I'm not offering a liberal perspective. I think liberalism itself has become part of the problem politically because it's too allied with capitalism, which is growth orientated and so on, which is now scientifically impossible to continue. And I think republicanism, because republicanism as a political theory recognizes contestation and sees that what's more important in a society is not freedom as non-interference, that's the kind of liberal view, but it's freedom as non-domination. And I won't go into that in too much detail now, but I'm happy to pick it up in the Q&A. But also, I think this celebration would be too strong, but at least a recognition of the inevitability of contestation can actually enhance problem solving. In a similar analogy, as I mentioned earlier, we in the academy, that's where we see new knowledge. We have to go through the peer review process. We're engaged in an element of live peer review this morning where people will question what I have to say, and that different views can help create better solutions, or at least we can learn to agree to disagree and both come away from that engagement enlightened and enhanced. And I do think there's something around that to be integrated into our thinking about this politically in terms of sustainability transformations. But I'm not saying that democracy can solve all our problems, that simply having more democracy is somehow going to be like a magic bullet, which would be the equivalent of a non-technological optimism that somehow, just make everything more democratic and that's going to solve it. I think we do need more democracy, but I'm not convinced that simply making more spaces for more democracy will in of itself produce the solutions that we desire. So I'm not saying that something like citizens' assemblies plus solar panels is suddenly bada bing, bada boom, going to result in the types of changes that are necessary. Because I think that idea of simply saying citizens' assemblies and renewable energy as a solution is rather reminiscent of Lenin, which I hadn't realized has particular, resonances and echoes, particularly for folk there in Estonia on this day, where this is Lenin's view, communism is Soviet power, which is decentralized worker power, plus the electrification of the country. So I think that idea of citizens' assemblies and solar panels is like an echo of this kind of naive, rather dogmatic and top-down almost perspective on the issue. And you can see this, though, in even groups that I've mentioned already. Extinction Rebellion, they have three demands: tell the truth about the climate crisis using science. We've got to act now with urgency. But then the last one, which I've always had a difficulty with, is this idea of beyond politics, that somehow you create citizens' assemblies and that's somehow going to be the solution. I think it's part of the solution, but I do think simply arguing for more democracy, such as citizens' assemblies, can put too much weight on these. What about changes to the structure of the economy? For example, what about looking at who are the powers in our productive spheres that are holding back, the fossil fuel industry and so on. And I think we have to recognize that, while we do need citizens' assemblies and other forms of what I would say more, genuine or more radical forms of democracy, such as democratizing the means of production, including more community and worker control over the electricity system, for example, or the agricultural system, and not just citizens' assemblies. I think that type of democratization, when it gets into the real aspects of the economy, that's where I think we're going to have to see much more empirical and indeed analytical work and also political work, and not just put all our focus on citizens' assemblies, a good step in the right direction as they are. But speaking as somebody who has lived in the north of Ireland for the last 25 years or so, as a post-conflict society, I've certainly learned some of the lessons of living in this society and observing it, and seeing that conflict transformation, I think, has lessons to be learned and integrated into our analyses, particularly of ideas of just transitions. there are two differences in the literature around post-conflict transformation. One is conflict management. So you want to stop people killing each other, fighting each other, or engaging in other forms of negative, acts often against each other. So you manage the effects. But actually, what we also need to do is engage in conflict transformation and try and figure out what are the underlying causes that are resulting in these effects. And I think too much of our policy, particularly around climate and energy transition, or climate policy more generally, is only dealing with the effects and not ultimately the underlying causes, which to me, they're much more politically difficult because they have to do with views of the good life, aspirations for high consumption lifestyles, for highly mobile lifestyles, and so on. Our politicians are much more comfortable with technological supply side solutions because it means we don't have to challenge consumption, for example, or indeed we don't have to talk about the structure of the economy. And I think that's where most of our societies in Europe are still at. We're talking about green growth, decoupling an ever-growing capitalist economy from negative energy and ecological and resource effects. The sad reality is we have absolutely no empirical evidence whatsoever that we can decouple a growing capitalist economy, which basically has to grow about 3% a year just to stay stable. We cannot have the green growth myth that I think the European Union, for example, is promoting in its European Green Deal. And we can talk about that in more detail if people want. But I do think we also have to recognize that sometimes engaging in conflict exacerbation can have a politically strategic important element in terms of political struggle. In other words, you essentially pick a fight to win it. In other words, it's where a movement can actually set the agenda. So rather than responding to a net zero consultation the government puts out, that a movement can actually begin to occupy, fossil fuel factories or stop mining from going on in order to exacerbate that conflict, to bring it to the public fore, and then obviously to try and win that particular struggle. So contestation can also be a chosen strategy and tactic. Of course, it can backfire, particularly in the media portrayal, because often the liberal media will focus on the disruption. So there's a strike action, and they'll focus on the commuters who can't get to work because the workers have down tools. And often they don't talk about what's the reasons why these people are engaging in this action. So it's a strategic choice for movements to make, and many of whom are aware of the downsides as well of engaging in this much more contestatory form of action. And I do think we have to really, I think, move beyond this liberal framing of what, this is Benjamin Barber from a book from some time ago called Strong Democracy. In liberal politics, it's essentially politics as zookeeping. There's a very constrained set of modes of action for a citizen. You vote if you want to, and most societies don't even have to vote. It's only in countries like Belgium and Australia where there's an obligation, well, at least if not to vote, to turn up to, spoil your ballot paper if that's your choice. But there's very little obligations on behalf of citizens to engage in politics. And this is what Barber said: liberal politics is politics as zookeeping, and therefore the robust debate and discussion that a Republican framing would celebrate and recognize as the essence of a much more stronger form of democracy is absent largely in the anemic liberal democratic electoral forms of politics that we have in most of our societies across Europe. And I do think that idea, just to hammer it home again, that idea of democracy is non-violent disagreement, and if not the celebration, at least a recognition as conflict as important. And it can actually, conflict and disagreement is not only inevitable, but actually, as I say, can add and aid problem solving. Certainly in work I've done on objections to renewable energy installation on the island of Ireland, it's clear that the way in which our legal system has set up the process of how objectors to wind farms, not all of whom are climate deniers, they're not reactionaries, they are people who are genuinely asking questions. Why should our local area, which is a beautiful local area, has a strong tourist sector or whatever, why is our area being sacrificed? And that's often the language people use for the greater good somewhere else. And I do think we need to find better ways of integrating those who object, including climate deniers and climate delayers. It's not about excluding those voices. Now, how we manage those, we can talk about in more detail, and I have one or two suggestions at the end, but we can't just exclude those that we disagree with. I mean, that's the logic of Twitter, or whatever it's called now, X, with that man Musk having taken over it. There's too dangerous a prospect that you often see on the online world, where you just simply defriend people you disagree with. I mean, that explains the toxic, often, environment of those spaces, is that it's people engaging in a form of groupthink, where they're excluding disconfirming views because they disagree with them. And then whenever they come up against somebody with a different view, then it turns into this very toxic trolling and very heightened negative reaction. We certainly don't want that in our politics. I mean, it's one thing to have it in the online world, where many people, I think, engage in this heightened negative forms of engagement because they're often anonymous. Not to say that in face-to-face, but there is a moderating element in human relationships whereby face-to-face interaction can moderate people's views, whereas I think people feel free in the anonymized world of the online environment. And I do think that this embracing of the inevitability of conflict in the political contestation around sustainability transitions, it helps us overcome another dangerous pathway that's very dominant in European countries. Every country has this to different extents, of this top-down, technocratic, often informed by a scientific, in inverted commas, or at least a selective scientific view of how we need to react to the climate crisis. And this Republican perspective that I'm presenting to you today, that kind of embraces, or at least recognizes, the importance of contestation, is very much based upon the work of this really good, excellent political theorist, Chantal Mouffe. And you can read here what she says in terms of, again, recognizing the importance, if not embracing and trying to celebrate conflict as if it's great. It is an inevitable part of human communication, is absolutely a central part of democratic politics. And politics, democratic politics in particular, should be the space in which we can deal with these different perspectives of the good life, the good society, the causes, the consequences, and the solutions to the climate crisis. And particularly this one. I do think that we're at the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, although I think there's going to be a backlash from the fossil fuel companies, particularly around the logic of net zero, which is basically not absolute zero, and it's certainly not negative carbon emissions. It's basically carbon offsetting, which allows the continuation of fossil fuel production. That's one thing I think fossil fuel companies are betting on. The other is that even the renewable energy that has been added to the grid in many of our societies, it hasn't displaced carbon energy. So what it really is, the renewable energy in many of our countries is fossil fuel plus. In other words, we're consuming even more energy or electricity, but now we have a higher proportion of it now being produced by renewable energy. Now, I'm saying that provocatively because it may be that there are some societies where we can absolutely see that the energy increase hasn't been that much, but actually the proportion of renewables has now begun to displace. I'm not seeing a lot of evidence of the displacement of carbon energy by renewable, but I do think this issue of moving beyond capitalism, neoliberalism, and excessive globalization and long supply chains for our economies, arguments for the selective relocalization of particularly food and energy, if nothing else. The war in Ukraine has brought home how everything from fertilizers to gas and oil, when you have long supply chains for food and energy, leaves you extremely vulnerable. So I do think we need to start thinking beyond, capitalism, and I'm simply using that as a descriptive term. And I think while there are normative arguments, ideological arguments you can have against capitalism, it's inequality producing, it doesn't recognize the unpaid work of women, I think we now have increasingly compelling scientific arguments that a growth-based, largely private market-orientated economy is simply functionally insufficient to the challenges and opportunities for what we need. Now, what replaces that, of course, is an open discussion, but I'm pretty convinced that alongside long-standing, very good and robust, I think, normative arguments about moving beyond capitalism, we now have functional scientific arguments that we need to move to a more coordinated, and indeed in parts of our economy, a more planned type of economy, not Soviet 5-year plans. I hasten to add, but we can talk about that more detail in the Q&A. So to begin to wind up, so what does this look like in terms of the actual reality, even in individual engagements? The bit that you can't see there is essentially that we won't win people over purely on science. You know, a climate skeptic and or climate denier, like I'm speaking partly of, you know, as somebody who's engaged in politics, and Northern Ireland sadly has a disproportionate amount of particularly Protestant evangelical citizens who don't agree with evolution, never mind climate science and so on. So I've got experience of practically dealing with people who deny that climate is a reality. And what I found out was that my training as a professor, as an academic, where an initial reaction is, well, I'm going to convince this person with the peer-reviewed science and show them the facts and so on, that doesn't often really work. And in fact, it comes across as rather arrogant to the other person, and you're being a woke, liberal, elitist intellectual telling this person what they should think. But what I have found is that we can potentially win people over by telling stories, you know, that essentially we, because often people who deny the reality of climate change, and certainly it's my experience of looking at the literature, certainly in Australia and America, where we have very high proportions of people who disagree with the science around climate, as indeed in my own society here in the north of Ireland. You know, one of the facts that we found from qualitative and quantitative research of studying people who deny the reality of climate change, they are disproportionately often on the right of the political spectrum. They often have quite religious fundamentalist views. And when you analyze the reasons for rejecting climate science and therefore climate action and climate policy, it has nothing to do, or not nothing, that's too strong. It often has little to do with the climate issue, is that they see climate politics as part of a cultural transition. It's an affront to their values and ways of life. In other words, as somebody told me locally where I was a politician, when they hear climate science, what they really hear is abortion, trans rights, and LGBTQ. So for a lot of people who disagree with climate science, they're seeing it as part of this godless, you know, progressive agenda that they see as a threat to their values. And I think once we recognize that, well, then we try and maybe detach, you know, the climate issues from those other cultural issues which are not necessarily part of it, or indeed to try and get alongside people who disagree with you fundamentally and try and speak to them on the basis of, well, you're a parent like me. I disagree with your religious views, but you're a valued member of my community. You're a fellow citizen. Can we not try and work something out? In other words, begin the conversation from a place of unity, or at least something that you both share, rather than going in, as many liberals do, as many academics, intellectuals do, with all guns blazing. You're a stupid idiot person. You're reading right-wing newspapers, and you're watching Fox News or GB News, and I'm going to tell you why you need to believe in climate science. That aggressive science or almost enlightenment formed approach is not very useful politically. It sometimes works in the academy, and this is where that analogy breaks down that I was making earlier on. Real politics is not like a seminar. You know, in the seminar, we can, you know, criticize rightly each other on the basis of, you know, false epistemological or ontological premises, or you made a methodological mistake. In the real world, in politics, those issues are not relevant. It is about storytelling. And it's not just because I'm Irish, I'm good at storytelling, but absolutely both as an academic and certainly as a politician and an activist, stories are how we make our lives meaningful. And that's often what the climate issue has lacked. What is its story? For most of our citizens, it's seen as horrible and negative. It's apocalyptic. It's a top down. It's telling them they can't fly, they can't eat red meat. and it's seen as something that is a threat to their ways of life and their aspirations for the future. Where is the positive climate stories of creating a better world, a more equal world? Yes, it may be a world beyond carbon where it's slower. We're relocalizing forms of production. We may have to deal with the messy and difficult issue of restructuring our economies beyond capitalism. But it is around what are the stories we are telling in terms of the climate crisis that sees it also as an opportunity of creating a better society for all. And we're already seeing this in terms of how do we deal with this cultural weaponization of the climate issue in many parts of Europe and indeed North America, where particularly if you're a coal miner in Poland or Appalachia in America, you often see the climate issue as a direct threat to your material interest of you and your community. So how do we engage in a just transition with people who are going to be displaced from their jobs? And I think that's where we need to move beyond this kind of naive and lazy view of the just transition as a win-win-win. There will be losers. The key issue is to explain to people why they can no longer be coal miners, but also then compensate them, retrain them, give them early retirement packages, other ways in which we can, recognize and indeed value their contribution. I think not everybody, but a lot of people who maybe have connections with the fossil fuel industry, whether it's coal, oil and gas and the ancillary industries in the manufacturing and automobile and so on. I think some of these people who are skeptical about the climate issue, they may lessen that skepticism if the climate movement was to recognize the contribution they have made to society, to thank them for their service. I mean, everything that we have in all our societies today has been built largely using carbon energy. And I think it's recognizing that while also then being honest with these people, these sectors of our society, and say, listen, you've done a great job. You did what society had to do in terms of the coal, oil and gas industry. But now we have to leave that stuff in the ground. We've got to move on to something else. That means you can no longer do the job you're currently doing, but in a just transition, which we can negotiate, we're going to try and figure out some other job and so on for you and your communities. And I think there's elements of that in the just transition discourse that's happening, very live in Germany with the Coal Exit Commission. It's already been done in Spain in terms of the retiring of all their coal mines some years ago, of that procedural justice, of including the voices of those who are going to be affected. And I think this issue of conflict transformation is also about seeing that, recognizing those deep ethical as well as cultural dimensions of these questions that we're talking about. Because for many people, they see the transition as a threat to their vision of the good life, a good life based upon high mobility, high consumption, and high carbon, which scientifically is simply impossible to continue in the future. But also associated with that then is the idea of a good society. I mean, the reality is we all live in petrocultural capitalist systems with liberal democracies for the most part. But we misinterpret a real meaning of the understanding of our societies if we don't recognize that fundamentally their societies are based upon carbon. Just to give you an example of this, and I'll finish on this because I know I've probably gone over time as I always do. A recognition of the importance of carbon energy can be seen in this kind of parlor game or dinner party question, which I'd encourage you to ask the students or next time you have friends around for dinner. And I'll ask it to all of you listening to me this morning. Is there anything in the room that you're in that has been made or not made in whole or part, or not transported there in whole or part without the use of carbon energy? It's really hard to think of it. And this shows you that energy, particularly carbon energy, hides in plain sight in our societies. So therefore, any political debate, contestation about moving beyond carbon energy is not just about, what I call biofueling the Hummer. That somehow, we just take out the bad coal, oil and gas and we stick in some renewable energy. It's the Hummer that's the problem, the structure of our economy, capitalist, growth orientated, globalist. But also that energy is not just a fuel. It informs visions of our good life. It's in our tummies in terms of the food or the really bad coffee that certainly I've had this morning. There's almost nothing in our societies in terms of the material interactions of our everyday lives. The synthetic fibers I'm wearing, often based on petrochemicals, the food we eat, fertilizer. For those of you from a farming background, you probably know if we couldn't fix nitrogen, an absolutely vital chemical we need to artificially enhance the fertility of the soil, millions of people would die. But it takes an awful lot of carbon energy to create nitrogen. Never mind then the tractor that's fueled literally by diesel. Then you have to process the food in a factory powered by carbon. Then it's sent to a processing plant, packaged up in plastic, again made from petrochemicals, transported to the supermarket, driven usually by, internal combustion engine vehicles, refrigerated, using carbon energy. We drive them in our cars. You may have an electric car, but is it powered by renewable energy? We take the food home and we cook it then using carbon energy. So every step from farm to fork, is what I'm trying to say, is based on carbon energy. And therefore, our discussions around the energy and sustainability transition in relation to the climate crisis is going to have to recognize that it's much bigger than a technical changing of the fuel. It's about changing of our views of the good life, changing of our views of a good society, which is why we have to be prepared for these cultural, clashes that we've already seen. So thank you for listening, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, John. I am thinking maybe it would be best if we could ask some clarifying questions or sort of shorter, make shorter comments directly to John, or yeah, if you want to add something which is directly similar in your own experiences, maybe we could use the next 10 minutes or so to do that, and after Alexandra's talk, we can try to bring the two talks together and have a discussion. But yeah, please, any clarifying questions or any suggestions what John could expand on. Okay, we already have many hands up. Okay, Burku, if that would, not sure about your name's spelling. Go ahead. Burku Eke Schneider.
Yes, true. Burcu Eke Schneider.
Sorry. Yes.
Hi. Thanks for this kind. I'm a peace worker, Burcu Eke Schneider. I'm working also peace building and conflict transformation. So I just one question about thinking about the green thinkers. What do you think about how green thinkers, politicians, or academicians can stop to support the idea of sending weapons to the conflict regions as a solidarity act? Can they transform this conflict and learn to build peace while preventing exploitation of the environment in the war? This is my question, because there's a huge contradiction about supporting for the transformation, for ecological awareness, but also producing and sending weapons to the all war areas. Just this is my question for the Barry. Thank you.
Yes, listen, thank you, Burcu Eke. That's a great question. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a performative contradiction, particularly for green parties in Europe, to be supporting the sending of weapons anywhere or supporting war. And the reason is very simple, is that every green party in the world has signed up to 4 green principles of any green party, one of which is non-violence and peace. And it does seem to me that there is a massive contradiction in, not challenging the militarization of our societies, not just for that reason of peace building, but also that the military globally is probably the biggest user of oil. Certainly the US military is the largest single organization that uses petroleum. So the demilitarization of our societies, I think, is necessarily part of decarbonizing them as well. It's very difficult, particularly in the context, well, do you have a right to fight if you're being attacked, and you've got the right to use even violence in a way for self-preservation? That is a genuine question. But I do think that, you cannot talk about climate change whereas also thought about peace building. And the last reason why I'd say this is that we have already seen wars for resources. I mean, the war in Iraq, the illegal war in Iraq, and the illegal occupation of Iraq in 2003 in a coalition led by America was a war for oil. The safest place to be in Baghdad when the American troops rolled in was in the Ministry of Oil, because they kept that clear, because they wanted to have access to the oil fields and so on. And so therefore, what I'm trying to get at is a world less dependent upon particularly oil, but also lesser so gas and coal, is not only going to add to a safer world in terms of reducing global climate change, because, you know, as we know, burning coal, oil and gas causes carbon dioxide emissions, which is the main greenhouse gas causing climate change, but it's also a geopolitically more stable world. I think we will have less wars, less geopolitical tension, the more we move away from carbon energy. It would also mean that Western countries are not on friendly terms with homophobic and oppressive regimes like in Saudi Arabia and so on, or the ways in which, you know, many countries, particularly Germany, realized how dependent they were on Russian gas as a result of the war in Ukraine. So I think there are multiple reasons why we absolutely have to connect demilitarization and decarbonization for those reasons that I've outlined. So thank you so much for your question.
Thank you. And next we have Marta Muniz.
Yeah, hi. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have always some issues with my thing. Anyways, so I'm a young biomedical scientist, doing my PhD here in Berlin. But I come from Brazil and from a family of campesino people and formerly enslaved. So I have to say though, like, being in the side of the university that doesn't talk about these things, I have an issue with talking about the problem being beyond academia, right? So the humanities is really good at recognizing when they are having issues of, let's say, colonialism, structural racism, but they're not very good at recognizing when their colleagues are having the same issues. So, for example, talking about climate change is an okay thing to do at my side of the university, but not climate justice. That's taboo. That invokes questions of colonialism, of critical whiteness, of environmental racism, right? And those are, I found out the hard way, being called into a billion commissions and being yelled by all kinds of like senior scientists and coordinators. Some of them don't speak to me anymore simply because I asked for an anti-discrimination workshop. Right, and that was after we were offered a field trip to go explore Namibia, where Germany had its very first concentration camps. So, oh, we're not allowed to talk about that, by the way. The director already said that we're not allowed to talk about Namibia. So, my question is, my comment first of all is, I disagree. I disagree that we should always go from the point that academia knows what they're doing. In STEM, it's really, really common. I don't talk to engineers anymore because the ignorance is just so baffling and you have to explain the very basics and they don't believe you. And, you know, and how can we move away from that kind of discourse? How can we actually sort of occupy those spaces that are so easy to occupy? I mean, if you guys are in a big campus, you might be sitting in the very same building of someone who does not and will not engage in climate justice and will oppress anyone below them who tries to do that, right? How are we? Is there any attempt to occupy those spaces so that we even have an academia that's united in climate justice? Because at the moment, we don't.
Oh, thank you, Marta. Funnily enough, I co-authored a paper in May, and I'll put it in the chat after my talk, criticizing the university for behaving in a business as usual manner as the planet burns, in not dealing with systematic discrimination, of not connecting not just demilitarization to decarbonization, but decolonialism to decarbonization. And it's called agents of unsustainability in terms of the role of the universities. So I absolutely accept what you're saying, in that I find it frankly flabbergasting to be surrounded by colleagues as I am here at Queen's University Belfast. I don't think it's any different than many of my colleagues listening to this call is, of people who are not as concerned as I am about the worsening climate crisis, And I don't talk about climate change. It's a climate catastrophe. You know, calling it climate change is like calling an invading army unwelcome guests. You know, just singularly inappropriate as the language. I mean, people are dying right here, right now because of this catastrophe. And it's based on the intersection of that climate injustice with issues of racial discrimination, the long, dark legacy of imperialism, the domination of the global economy by particularly European and North American interests and societies. The cost of living crisis, which we're now experiencing in Europe, is part of the cost of the climate crisis as well. And it's about joining up those dots. I would say our crisis in democracy, as I was kind of intimating in my talk, that's also part of this crisis. And I'd even go further. The coronavirus crisis was also part of the effects of our planetary crisis, of people now encroaching on areas of wilderness and releasing pathogens and so on that can move zoonotically from animals to humans. So all these things are connected. What we have is a polycrisis, which is a socio-ecological climate energy crisis, but it's intersected with things such as gender injustice. It's intersected with racial injustice, and this includes even within the academy, you know, which people don't often realize. Like, for example, just to give you one concrete example, because I'm currently writing a book and I'm just looking at this the other day, a lot of the historical evidence we have that we now use to inform our climate science was actually collected by British imperialist scientists in the 19th and 20th century. Not for the interest of what we now use it in terms of tracking, you know, global climate change, but essentially to aid British imperialist interest around the world. Even the concept of sustainability and sustainable development has its origins in the plantations in Africa and elsewhere. It was like the minimum amount of food you could feed to those who were slaves on a plantation to maximize the yield. That's where sustainable yield comes from, which itself comes from German forestry in the 17th and 18th century. And the last thing I would say is I feel particularly passionate about this because Ireland is unique, certainly in many European countries, that we were colonized as well, you know, by a larger power, by Britain. Actually, the plantation was actually practiced in Ireland in the 16th and 17th century. In fact, it's still a term that's used often pejoratively for those people from Scotland in particular who are planted in Ireland on these plantations. So Ireland in a way is kind of unique in a way. It's a white European society, but it has experienced colonization, which I think makes us often particularly attuned to those efforts by, you know, whether it's La Via Campesina, you know, those indigenous movements we see rising up around the world is very familiar to us, particularly in terms of those countries that did achieve at least partial independence after the Second World War. So they formally received independence from their former colonial masters, but then without economic freedom, you know, because the economic system itself globally is set up in a systematically exploitative way, an extractivist way. Full freedom hasn't been delivered for those people. So the emancipation of former colonized peoples is still a work in progress. And the very last point I would make on this, there is a particular green twist to this colonial extractivism now, is that many of the technologies that are being promoted by the European Green Deal, by many of our governments in Europe, electric cars, windmills, and so on, all require rare earth metals, which are often mined in the global south. You know, lithium, cadmium, zinc, and so on, often mined in horrendous human rights abusing conditions and also highly toxic and environmentally damaging ways, that there's almost like we in the global north, the very, you know, societies that created the global climate catastrophe in terms of we're the high consumption societies, we're the ones who've used a disproportionate amount of the Earth's capacity to absorb our greenhouse gas emissions. We will now double the injustice on the global south by exploiting the global south for the very metals and things we need to make this green transition. And I think that is why we absolutely have to put front and center, as you said, Martha, the language should be either the climate catastrophe and climate justice together, and to move away from these often apolitical, domesticating terms like the Anthropocene, which really annoys me, because the Anthropocene, strictly speaking, means the age of the human, as if every human on the planet is the cause of the current catastrophe that we're now experiencing. Strictly speaking, this is the age of the Plantationocene or the Capitalocene. This is the language we should be using, because it puts forefront, and I know it's disturbing, particularly for European academics and scientists. Oh my God, here we go, talking about injustice. But this is not an apolitical free zone. This is dripping in injustice, intersectional injustice. And I think Europe has to come to a reckoning with the legacies of imperialism, which is what made our societies rich. You know, why do we think our societies in Europe became so rich and powerful that somehow we're one part of the human race that's uniquely got the brains, that we're geniuses, that we have found ways of developing productive capacities that's outside the realm of other people's? No, it's because we got to oil and coal first. We had the biggest armies, and we then spread out and dominated other people. And a lot of the industrialization in Europe in the 19th and 20th century was literally fueled on the backs and the bodies and the resources of people in the global south. So thank you so much for your question. You're absolutely correct. Decolonization, demilitarization, decarbonization, these are the things we need to start talking about in the academy. And if we're not, we're colluding with the status quo. This myth of green growth, this myth of business as usual, which I think is now going to come to an end pretty soon in the coming decades, because it's simply unsustainable. It's a path to ecocide, never mind to multiple forms of injustices.
Okay, Jasmina.
Hi, everyone. Hi, John. Very good to see you in this context as well. Jasmina Husanovic from the University of Tuzla and from Slobodi Tuzla ECOFEM, Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I'd like to thank you for your lecture, inspiring as usual. And I wanted to ask something that's relevant for us who are actually engaged in these experimental efforts on the local level between academics, activists, and citizens, namely local assemblies, local citizens' assemblies on energy justice. And we've been doing those in Tuzla for more than a year now, and Tuzla being a big cold region and industrial city. Just a little bit of context for others, and also Bosnia as a site of really all various forms of colonial extractivism, post-conflict, post-conflict and transitional society, and definitely a site that should be seen not only as the global south, but as the, more specifically, geographically speaking, as the EU South. So my question is, if you know specifically of any platforms or formats where various people from various sites who are actually engaged in these local assemblies on energy justice, where they maybe meet or converse or share experiences, is there some kind of transnational classroom or platform or activity that connects specifically those locales that actually are involved from their own specific context in some sort of different agonistic, democratic, or green republican normative framing, especially when it comes to radical democracy versus via local assemblies. So that's the question, because I haven't asked you that the last time we met, but also there are other people here who might know of similar examples or similar formats where these discussions and possible collaborations are taking place. Thanks.
Hi, Yasmina. Good to hear from you again. My honest answer is no. I can't think off the top of my head of examples of what you speak of. That does not mean to say, of course, that these need to be created, and perhaps that's the issue, that these type of inclusive, radical democratic fora, localized, so that because that's more tangible for people in terms of, well, effectively it's almost like asset mapping your local area. What are our assets? Well, we can't use our coal anymore, but what are the other assets in our society that we can now use to help us make this transition, provide good jobs, and to make sure that we have all the things that we need. And it's almost like a resource-based view of the economy. And that's where I do think that we need to go, certainly in our planning economically around the future, is moving away from these monetized understandings of the economy and say, what are the actual assets, the land, the labor, the resources of our society, without seeing that somehow we're going to engage in what the Greeks called autarky, or from the ancient Greek, that's somehow that we're going to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. The only examples I can come up with maybe are in some more radical elements of the trade union movement. There is a part of the International Labour Organization called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. I think they're based in New York. They may have examples of what you're talking about. The other, sorry, Yasmina.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, I think Jean and Ronan, could I ask you maybe to come back after Alexandra's talk with your questions? Is that okay? Or do you feel it's very directly related and it's quite short? Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Mine is kind of that's fine. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, we're running. Yeah, it's getting a bit too tight afterwards. Otherwise, so Alexandra, I can't see you at the moment. I hope you haven't disappeared.
I'm here.
Excellent.
I just had the camera off. Save band.
Thank you.
I'm here. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Let me see. So hopefully you can see that, right, Ayet? You can?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just start by saying that I do sometimes have bad bandwidth, and if I get kicked out, apologies, I'll try and re-enter the room as soon as possible. I'm also, slightly nervous, I suppose, to stand in for Clodagh. So Clodagh couldn't come. For those that came in late, unfortunately, she had an eye injury, so she had to cancel at the last minute. So I have the difficult task to try and stand in for Clodagh, as well as, come after John and his really interesting talk. Clodagh was going to talk about her experiences, her extensive experiences with Citizens' Assembly and the vast history of Citizens' Assemblies in Ireland. So I don't bring that experience. However, I have worked with Clodagh in trying to bring down the Citizens' Assembly, at least some of the principles of deliberative democracy, to the local level. So we looked at deliberative and participatory research methods for co-production, collaborative engagement, evaluation, and ultimately to look for transformation in terms of climate action. So this is part of the Imagine 2050 project, which was a project that started at the end of 2018 and ended roughly about a year ago, and involved a lot of people, including John Barry. It was kind of focused in Ireland, but it did bring in a transdisciplinary consortium, which included sociologists, geographers, political scientists, process and chemical engineers, energy modelers, and others. And I suppose just linking that with Marta's, comment about the difficulty of having this sort of conversation from a transdisciplinary perspective, this very much, was an effort in that way to sort of bring different disciplines from the STEM side and from the social science and humanities side to sort of, develop some good processes that, entail the complexity of all the conversations around climate change. And actually, Professor Edmund Byrne gave a talk to our group, our shift group, and we recorded that talk in terms of his experience with transdisciplinarity from a STEM perspective, which, you know, could be useful for you guys to refer to if this is of interest to you. So just moving on in terms of the rationale for developing deliberative processes. So this very much, it was funded by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Imagine 2050 project, and it was part of a sort of a wider look at developing the national dialogue for climate action. And within that, a real emphasis on the value of deliberative democracy as something that is quite useful, you know, in terms of promoting societal citizen engagement and promoting that really importantly beyond the ballot box. And that's important because political engagement and I suppose citizen engagement is in a sort of a crisis. You know, we don't have the same sort of engagement with party politics we used to have in the past. There's a lot of distrust, I suppose, across Europe in terms of engaging with the political process. You know, people are not turning up to vote anymore in the same extent that they used to before. There's also a crisis, I think, to a degree in terms of the expert knowledge, you know, or the technocratic ruling as well. So in some ways, the deliberative process is seen as a way to tackle those problems and to engage people in a different way. So instead of direct democracy, you know, in terms of just voting, or representative democracy in terms of, you know, having your politicians represent yourself, you have this new way of thinking about democracy called deliberative democracy. And specifically, you know, you're looking at principles such as fact-based discussions. So, you know, the problem sometimes with voting, or say, for example, in referenda, it might have been that you didn't have access to the information, or you're voting on something where you've had, you know, limited opportunity to engage with all of the evidence, you know, to make yourself an informed decision. You might only be thinking of yourself, you know, and this is another thing that's, I suppose, really important in terms of the deliberative processes, is that it's other regarding. So we're not just making decisions for ourselves, we're making decisions for the collective, you know, and in that sense, we might engage with the problems of farmers, with the problems of people, you know, whose livelihoods are being destroyed because of the energy transition or something like that. So we're taking all of these complexities and, you know, the livelihoods of others, not just of ourselves, into consideration. And we're also looking at the future as opposed to the short-termism, you know, that's implicated in a lot of political processes, just looks at election 5-year slots, you know, and we might need to consider the future and the future impacts in climate change in that regard. So that's really important. And I think it's really important as well in terms of considering deliberative democracy is positioned as a way, I suppose, as Brown and others have said, to hold the future together. John has talked a little bit about it. There's a lot of polarization, you know, there's a lot of divides around this debate. The future is also fragile. You know, what we think our future will be is disrupted constantly, you know, by climate change, as well as the, you know, our efforts to adapt to a changing climate. So for that sense, I suppose, you know, that emphasis on consensus, or an emphasis on togetherness, or an emphasis on trying to find, you know, a shared voice is important, you know, and that's where you see, for example, a lot of emphasis nowadays in terms of the energy citizen or the food citizen, you know, because you're trying to sort of hold together, you know, people into a shared sense of an objective, you know, a shared sense of a shared future that we can all strive for. So that's just in terms of the rationale. So what we did, though, was we tried to bring some of those ideas to the local level. And to do that, we tried to bring in some new methodologies, I suppose, to engage with people locally in terms of the discussions. And some of them, you know, really holding to these principles of other regarding, fact regarding, and future regarding. So we looked at, these are not new tools, we didn't invent them, but we kind of brought them into the sort of deliberative engagement process, and we tested them out. So these include sense making, empathy mapping, which was really important in terms of, you know, looking at these different personas and looking at their needs, their concerns, their wants, you know, and trying to find sort of policy or recommendations that speak to them, that address their own specific concerns. Storyboarding, really important, as John said, you know, trying to sort of create a shared storyline around our, you know, local transitions to a better future. And other methodologies, including community mapping, audience polls. And interestingly, although we say we're going to go beyond the ballot, you know, in terms of a deliberative process and trying to reach a sort of a shared voice at the end, the ballot might be an interesting thing, you know, to consider in terms of voting for a share recommendations and maybe establishing if there's consensus around, you know, particular recommendations. So these were some of the methodologies that we used. And you can find some of that work in a toolkit that we published called Deliberative Futures Toolkit, and that's open access, and you can find that on our website. Just in terms of positioning, you know, that work that we did in terms of trying to localize some of these deliberative processes. So in terms of when we're talking about deliberative engagements, there's different models out there. You know, you have citizens' juries, you have citizens' assemblies, which are the more notorious ones. You have future workshops, and then what we termed sort of deliberative futures workshops, very much focused on those three principles that I mentioned earlier: fact, other, and future regarding. And there's distinctions around, you know, numbers of participants, numbers of meetings, recruitment methods, the type of activities that you engage in, and what comes out of these particular forms of engagement. So, for example, in terms of the Citizens' Assembly, random selection is a really important aspect of that, you know, in terms of ensuring that you have a representative sample of citizens nationally, you know, that are kind of coming together and, you know, really kind of representing that diversity of opinion, representing that diversity of experience across a particular country or area. However, we thought that there was limitations in that sort of approach, and we kind of align that with sort of purposive sampling. So we did target people, because while you can, you know, sample or kind of randomly select people and invite them to take part, there's no reason why they should accept that invitation.
Have we lost you? It looked like we've lost Alexandra. Oh dear. Just until she hopefully recovers, or her link recovers, I just wanted to point everyone to the chat, which has a number of resources already pointed out by several of our speakers and commenters. So please take note, and I will try to save the chat and send the chat link or chat list of links also around, so we can use them at a later date, or you can recover them at a later date. Alexandra is back. Sorry, we lost you.
Here, I'm so
Are you
sorry.
okay now? So stop.
I don't know how
exciting
much,
moment.
I don't know how much it was missed, or, you know, I was
that was
talking about the
That was
methodologies.
the same slide. Yeah. So
it was that same slide. Okay, that's perfect. So it wasn't very long. Apologies for that.
Don't worry.
So I was saying there's methodologies, and we also kind of look at the process of developing the agenda ourselves. We and a survey and a level of networking to develop the agenda local in terms of what do you want to talk when we're talking about climate action, you know, what are the things that you think, or what are knowledge gaps that you have, that you'd like some expert presentations on, in terms of having that aspect of good, robust information available, to frame whatever discussions, might come from those local engagements. So there was 3 stages that the first.
Alexandra, maybe you can turn off your. Sorry, you're just breaking up a bit. Maybe you can turn off your video, even though it's quite unnatural not to see you while you're speaking. But that might help.
Yes, that's what I'll do.
Sorry, just a couple of last sentences we couldn't hear.
Yeah, so there's the different stages of engagement. The second stage were the workshops themselves, and this involved sort of an initial stage of just kind of looking at different visions, the different aspirations for the community, opening, your imagination, and just kind of sharing ideas, and eventually, shaping that down into a set of recommendations coming from those deliberative moments. So these happened over 2 weekend-long events, and I suppose that's one thing about deliberative engagements. They're long-winded. They take time, to hear everybody, to sort of have the opportunity to hear about interesting facts and important things that are going on in your community. You need time to sit down and to listen to others, and to listen to the information that's available, and to consider that. So there's time heavy commitments in terms of asking people to get involved, and that's often a problem in terms of resources, as well as people's commitment to something like this. But we also added a third stage, which I think is important, and is something that I'm going to sort of connect with the relevance, I think, of citizens' assemblies and deliberative processes, is connecting what comes out of these workshops to a wider, deliberative, or to a wider democratic process, or sharing these with politicians, sharing these with policymakers, sharing these with the wider community, sharing these conferences. It's so important to get the feedback. These things don't just happen in isolation. There needs to be a much wider ecology of things that these deliberative processes are connected to, and that's, I think, one of the most important things that is coming out of this work. Sorry, just trying to change the slide. So just to give you an idea, just to give you an idea of some of the community wise, and people, after imagining much things for the future of their particular community in Ballincollig and in the south of Ireland, they've sort of came to terms with this is certain things that they'd really like to see in their community, and that included micro energy generation, nature-based solutions, developing wildlife corridors, etc. So those are some of the ideas that were there. Another important process, I think, and this kind of then speaks about what is the outcome for the individual that takes part in these processes, and were we successful in promoting that deliberative process? So we did an evaluation, and it's a really important thing, I think, when you're kind of trying to carry out these processes, that you do have the opportunity for people to give you some feedback on what they felt about the process. So that's what we did, and we had a little survey at the end with 48 participants took part in that, along 2 different communities. One, as I said, in Cork, and the other one was in Athlone, which is the Midlands, also in Ireland. So one of the questions was, do you think that, or it says, I kept some of my thoughts to myself for fear of the reactions of others. And people voted on that. And you can see here that 60% disagreed or completely disagreed, that they kept their thoughts to themselves. So the indication there was that it was fairly an open process, that we somehow managed to facilitate, and create an open space for people to share their thoughts, but also there was still, you know, a small percentage of people that, you know, didn't share their thoughts. So, you know, there's obviously some learning there and some improvement in terms of how do you promote open spaces that people feel that, you know, completely free to express their opinions. And then in terms of changing minds, you know, the statement there, sorry, says, I changed my view as a result of the table discussions. And I think this one is really interesting because most people were very ambiguous about this. You know, 49% actually said they neither agreed or disagreed with the statement. So in terms of having people, you know, come to a real change in the way that they're thinking about climate in their community, there wasn't really much change, or at least they didn't perceive that there was a lot of change. I suppose we can connect this to the fact that a lot of people that did end up attending these workshops already were concerned about the climate, and there's been recently a big national-wide survey around climate change in the Irish mind here in Ireland, and largely people do align, you know, and are concerned about the environment. So, you know, there wasn't change. There wasn't a lot of, say, for example, climate deniers or people that, you know, don't want to see, you know, change happening in their community in terms of climate. What there was a big change, though, was in people's hearts, changing hearts as opposed to changing minds. And people said that from attending this event, I'm encouraged and motivated to continue to participate in climate action issues. And I think this is an important aspect. You know, if you facilitate a process, a deliberative process where people feel heard, where people feel there's an opportunity to look at all of the information and to, you know, to really break it down and to develop together solutions, you know, that the motivation to continue doing something and to continue to engage in the issue really increases. So I think that's the most positive piece of information from our evaluation, you know, was in terms of changing people's hearts rather than changing people's minds. Another thing that we did, and that kind of relates to the third stage that I mentioned there in terms of, you know, taking those recommendations developed during the deliberative processes and sharing that with different layers of society, was a combination of processes. So we combine our deliberative workshops. We created a set of recommendations based on those deliberative workshops, and we put these to a panel of experts. And it was a panel of experts that was made up of both policymakers as well as academics from multiple disciplines and from multiple areas of climate action, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, energy, biodiversity, among other things. So, and what we found actually that there was largely agreement around the recommendations that were made by our communities when we put these recommendations to our expert panel, but that actually, you know, a more shallow level of agreement when you drill down in terms of the fine detail of actually applying some of those recommendations at the local level, that's where, you know, the problem came through. And I suppose it's a sort of a warning in terms of building consensus, is that you can have a consensus around a very large vision of change or the need for climate change, for climate action and for energy transitions, but the devil is always in the detail. And actually, you know, that consensus really can be very shallow, and it can hide a lot of levels of deeper disagreement in terms of how you do that, you know, how you do that in a fair way. So, you know, breaking that down is an exercise that's required. And it kind of shows the significance of doing these exercises and combining them. You know, if you put something like this to experts and then you start seeing, you know, that in practice doing some of these things, you know, might bring around a whole set of new problems, then, you know, it's in itself a very educational thing. Also, you know, you can see the paper there. We've recently published this paper. It was led by one of our colleagues, Stephen Flood, and it's open access. So, you know, you can take the details there. We also saw that there was difference between our experts, and that there was, you know, a larger share of agreement between the academics with the local communities than there were with policymakers and local communities. So deeper levels of disagreement, again, you know, coming from policy experts or people that are, you know, putting some of these stuff in practice in terms of the government. So I suppose, you know, just connecting then to this idea of deliberative democracy, deliberative processes, and, you know, their significance around climate action. We recommend through the work that we develop in Imagine 2050 that deliberative engagement, citizens' assemblies, deliberative workshops, yes, are important, but they're not very impactful if they're not connected, you know, to wider other forms of engagement within society, including activism, including political representation, including education, research, etc. And the toolkit that we developed, actually, that I shared with you earlier, we sort of recommend that, you know, deliberative moments can be part of many things. They don't just need to be part of a citizens' assembly. You can actually have deliberative moments within your educational, you know, efforts. And actually, one of our colleagues, Fionn Rogan, he's an energy modeler. He does these deliberative engagements with his students around, for example, energy technological options, you know, a debate on whether, for example, nuclear energy has a future in our efforts to bring.
Sorry, Alexandra, we're losing you again.
Apologies. I'm nearly finished now. Apologies. So
maybe
can you giving an example there?
Yeah, can you just repeat the last sentence? I think we didn't get it.
Okay, apologies for that.
No.
So I was just giving an example where we can bring some of these deliberative engagements to other processes, including you know, within education. As I was saying, you know, you could have these deliberative moments as part of your efforts to, you know, educate the future generations. And actually, you know, just to talk about bringing this to other levels, I know that Clodagh was giving some talks. She was invited to talk to members of Extinction Rebellion to see where actually deliberative moments, deliberative processes can fit in within that activism. So I think we're starting to see, you know, a hybrid of different sort of approaches coming through, which is quite exciting and interesting, I think. So I'm going to leave it there. There's some extra resources that you can find on our website. And if you need to contact me, there's my contact details. Thanks again, and apologies for issues with the internet.
Not at all. Thanks so much. It's a struggle, isn't it? So thank you for coping so well. Should we do the same thing, that if there are sort of direct questions to Alexandra, maybe we can take these maybe a bit shorter time than before, let's say until sort of 40 past, or 22 rather, and then let's move on to having a more general conversation. So anybody who would like to do that, Jeanne, your hand is up already.
Thank you very much. So actually the question that I was going to ask of John is relevant for Alexandra also. I think both very interconnected. First of all, thanks to both for some fascinating presentation and discussion, some really interesting ideas being raised here. So Alex, you were talking about participatory democracy and citizen engagement and everything else. And John, you had mentioned the crisis in democracy that we are experiencing at the moment. And John, you had also referenced the military, the farming lobby in Ireland and other countries. I guess the question that I'm trying to frame, with all of the lobbies that exist and that have so much power within our democracies in their current form, is it feasible for the participatory processes to challenge those lobbies appropriately and to actually achieve substantive change, given the amount of power that rests within those lobbies, if that makes sense? Sorry,
John, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, okay. Thanks if you want to come in. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, participatory initiatives by themselves will certainly not achieve the necessary transformation. My own view is that, as I think I alluded to in my talk, where we're talking about democracy, we should be asking ourselves, why should democracy end at the factory door, the office door, the lecture door, and not just about saying that democracy in radicalized, temporary citizens' assemblies are the be-all and end-all. And I don't think anybody engaged in citizens' assembly work sees it as the solution. My own view is that we're going to have to start challenging the power of those vested interests in the media, in government, in the farming lobby, in the manufacturing sector, and so on, through what we're seeing across Britain at the moment of, for example, strike action by trade unions. I mean, I do think there is a particular role for trade unions in this space. There are no jobs on a dead planet. And for those of you listening to me in Ireland, there's no United Ireland on a dead planet either in terms of the debates we're having across the island. And certainly I would be supportive, both normatively and strategically, of occupying universities, of occupying factories and offices as non-violent, perfectly, in my view, legitimate. Yes, they may be seen as illegal because you're transgressing private property, but that's part of the issue that we're now in. And I really do want to double down or reiterate what I said at the beginning. At this current moment in human history, our governments have broken the social contract. They are threatening us, our kids, and the next generation by their failure to tackle these powerful, whether they're farming or fossil fuel interests. In that context, we cannot depend upon our government to actually do what is necessary, at least through the normal liberal democratic means that most of us have been used to. And I say this regretfully and with a lot of sadness, that I just think the liberal democratic system as we currently know it is broken. It is not sufficient to the challenge and the opportunities that lie ahead. And we are going to have to start seeing localized experiments in new ways of organizing our societies. And I do think that will include, as I say, occupying essentially the means of production. That's where real power in our society lies. Who owns and controls the factories, the capital, including the intellectual capital of our societies? And that's a very old debate, kind of like a prelude to revolution. And if that's how it's perceived, well, in my view, so be it. That's perhaps what we need. Polite women did not get the vote. I'll repeat that again. Polite women did not win the vote. The vote wasn't given to women. African Americans didn't win their freedoms and limited civil liberties. You take these; they have to be struggled for, and I think that's. And I don't want to come across as overly antagonistic or kind of almost militaristic, but there is that issue which is very uncomfortable for most of us in the academy, which has a rather kind of liberal, progressive, more or less ethos that the system can be changed through reform. I don't think it is. I used to think that. That's why I was engaged in liberal politics for so long with the Green Party, thinking that when you get elected, you try and check. Having been inside that system, it's completely dysfunctional and simply not up to the task. We are going to have to engage in much more radical, disruptive transformations in our economies, our societies, and our cultures. But for me, it's about presenting that as inevitable in some respects, because the system itself is not able to deal with it, but also as exciting. We're talking about, rolling up our sleeves here and creating different types of societies because our governments have failed to do so. But I know what I'm saying here now will strike many people as, something a very younger student might say if I was 30, 40 years younger. I'm saying this regretfully and purely, as I say, for functional reasons now. I cannot see any capitalist way out of this crisis. I cannot see any technocratic or technological way out of this crisis. Ultimately, this is a crisis of culture, of values, of our visions of a good society and a good life. And I just think that we need to move beyond liberal democratic reformist politics at this stage. And if we are going to talk about democracy, let's talk about cascading democracy into the sphere of production, into the academy, into other areas of our life, and not saying that democracy is only for elections or occasional citizens' assemblies.
I would add, in terms of the farmers lobbying, that it's a misguided, misdirected discussion as well. And I'd agree with John in terms of bringing that means of production. And that was recognized in the local discussions that we had in terms of very complex supply chains, and the farmers being at the bottom of that, you know, often with a lot of, so you'd have to consider that in terms of the small farmer, you know, but we're not talking about big farmers when we're talking about the change that's needed. We're really talking about a very complex supply chain, and really kind of difficult to budge stakeholders, you know, and that's where our target should be, you know. And that was recognized in the recommendations that we developed on that particular topic. And, you know, methodologies for us like empathy mapping and getting, you know, general publics to consider, you know, the needs of the farmer and what's happening to farmers was an important aspect of that.
Thank you, Alexandra. Erwin, your hand is up.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes. My comment in the chat room was on the citizens' assemblies, because I made a survey for the Austrian government on climate assemblies in the world. I made a survey on 12 climate assemblies, and the conclusion was similar in what I've heard now. They are working. The people are happy in it. They make good recommendations. Everything is fine. But the big question is afterwards, what's happening with the recommendations? And this is normally, to my mind, always excluded in the discussion, but this is the hot topic. And that means my question is, where does the consultative attitude came in? Because in the last year, I was very interested in the old ancient Greece example. And they had always a combination of lottery-based, the bowl parts of democracy, with direct democracy. There always was the combination. The big decisions have always been done by the people themselves. And elected persons, they had some elected persons, they made proposals, they made initiatives, and they were good for executing the decisions, but never for deciding. The elected persons. Then I looked at Florence and Venice in the 13th and 14th century. And again, it was a combination of lottery-based systems. They have been deciding these lottery-based systems and not consulting. The other were consulting, and the lottery-based persons have been deciding. And it was combined with direct democracy, and again and again. And only in the last century, I would say in the 50s and 60s, with Planungszelle in Germany, etc., my explanation is, but I want to hear what you are thinking about, is the liberative democracy and the so-called representative democracy, which was never representative, was already there. And the only way they accepted deliberative processes is, yes, you can make and discuss whatever you want, but we are deciding. You can make proposals, you can present ideas, that's fine. And we will also finance it with taxpayers' money, as long as it is very clear that we are deciding in parliaments and governments. But this is the big problem, because if we make good proposals and recommendations in these deliberative processes, and they are completely rejected in parliaments and governments, and it's the case in the 12 climate assemblies I looked at, and it was Washington, DC, Ireland, UK, Denmark, Austria, Spain, etc., etc., very small parts of the recommendations have been implemented, but they don't make any difference, to be honest. No flights in 4 hours in France, it doesn't make any difference. All the big questions, carbon pricing, stop of combustion engines, etc., the hard decisions, they have been completely rejected. And that's because the fossil fuel interests are very good organized, a lot of money, They have good influence on the so-called representative system. And they said, we can't do these recommendations of the climate assemblies. They would ruin us. There's big competitive problems. It would be unfair, not financing, etc., etc. So my question is, how can we combine consultative or deliberative processes with real decision-making? One of those proposals of Democracy International is combine it with direct democracy, as the Greeks did it 2,500 years ago, or make this sortation processes itself deciding. This is the question we have to deal with, because as long as we are on the consultative side, there is no impact at all, to my mind. But maybe I have, you have other experiences, and I would like to hear about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Erwin. I think we are pretty much now into the more general discussion, even though if there is anything specific to Alexandra as well, then you can please make sure you ask and address this. So Alexandra, do you want to start?
Yeah, I suppose, and this is where Clodagh would really come into her own. She has a lot of experience of evaluating exactly, you know, where do these processes go, impact, and I definitely agree with you. I think Clodagh would too. Into the recommendations that come out of the actually mentioned earlier.
Breaking.
We have
Sorry,
someone
Alexandra.
here, Aoife Dean, who.
Alexandra, if
sorry,
you can
video off again
your...
to make sure that.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Try again.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we have someone here. Aoife Dean is her name, who was involved in a citizens' assembly. Aoife Dean is here, and you know, if she'd like to say something about the process recently, a citizens' assembly and biodiversity and the involvement of youth in that, it would be great. But we've looked, I suppose, at this, you know, and I agree that sometimes it is more impactful to link it with other layers of democracy. So, for example, you know, if you're going to a referendum, developing that ballot through a deliberative process is much more impactful, you know, than sort of, you know, wording the ballot with no consultation level at all, you know. So that can be a really impactful way that you can do. Constitutional change in Ireland has also been an area, you know, where deliberative democracies or process have been shown to be impactful. Yeah, John, if you want to come in on that to provide further comment.
No, I think I've got nothing more to add, and I know we're running short of time to allow other people to ask questions.
Sure. So, Bern?
Thank you very much for your talks. Very interesting thoughts. Thank you very much. And everybody's talking about stories and storytelling and about the stories about the good life, and that's for me very abstract. So professionally, I'm interested in how people want to make the future, and I asked my students at the film university to come up with, to write stories that can make people imagine what the good life could be, and they had a very hard time. And then when you said there is these great barriers, there's vested interests, and there's people trying to not make a transformation, do you think we need antagonists? So stories about, because otherwise, I guess, it's the farmers that are the antagonists, or it's the people gluing themselves on the streets of the antagonists, or the people driving the cars on the other side. So do we need to kind of label these antagonists?
My own view is no, because you're talking about dividing people who need to come together. I mean, to me, this is a systemic structural issue. It's not farmers. Farmers are part of a larger globalized agri-food system, and certainly in Ireland, they're at the lower end of the value chain, and they've been manipulated by certainly large farming interests and agri-chemical corporations. And that's who we need to direct our attention to, is in terms of fossil fuel interests, large businesses, you know, political parties and politicians that are too close to fossil fuel or big tech or big agricultural interests. because it's too easy.
That's the type of antagonist I mean.
Yes. So it's not about farmers, it's about the farming system in which farmers are forced to engage in ecocidal, unsustainable, and extremely poor forms of return for themselves. And the problem is that the media, including the social media context in which we now live, certainly in many parts of the world, thrives on setting climate activists against farmers. Woke liberal professors in the university against, good peasant or coal miners and so on. And that's an issue we have to simply recognize in terms of calling it out for what it is. And it is about what is the cross, sectoral alliances whereby we can imagine trade unionists with members of the faith community who take their, say, for example, Christian stewardship duties correctly, or they've read the Pope's Laudato Si, can also join forces with Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. I can see elements of that at the local level. This maybe goes to Yasmina's question about these unlikely alliances that we may see. But at the moment, as I mentioned there in my talk, and also Alex was mentioning, we have this farmers versus the climate, which I think we need to absolutely overcome. This should be against capitalism, against the carbon energy system that has now outlived its usefulness, but is benefiting a small minority. I mean, one thing that goes without saying, just to conclude these remarks, is that we now have the empirical evidence that the vast majority of global and national greenhouse gas emissions is emitted by a wealthy elite. Now, sadly, some of us on this call globally may be part of that elite. It is not the poor in sub-Saharan Africa that we need to be concerned about. So therefore, we need to start recognizing that if we are going to tackle this issue, well, let's make our societies less unequal as a functional pathway to get to where we want to go. So therefore, let's put our energies into challenging the system and those who are benefiting from the system, rather than having working people conflicting against working people.
This is
Alexandra, did you want to add anything?
No, we can just go to the questions.
I was just going to pop in a question that was in the chat, which I think was already has been up there for some time, which is from Caroline Ward, who was asking, which methods of deliberation do you think are most impactful in terms of making change? I don't know if you can assess anything in this way, but if you can, that would be helpful, perhaps.
Citizens' assemblies are definitely having their moment, of fame, and I think they can be very important. And I know, for example, here we had the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity, youth getting involved, and that can be a very exciting thing. And I think it can be transformative, because when we talk about citizenship, activating these spaces where you can become a deliberative citizen, where you come together, it's a great opportunity. I think, though, it needs to be connected to, better action. It needs to be connected then to decision making, and that's where we're lacking in those connections, between the processes. But in itself, I see a lot of potential for deliberative democracy. I'm reminded of, when we had the launch of our toolkit that I mentioned. We had the benefit of a contribution from Oliver Escobar, who has done a lot of work on citizens' assemblies in Scotland. And he often says that, while, a lot of people say that these spaces don't have bite, don't have that sort of impact that they should, a lot of policy making that's just technocratic is very heartless and very mindless of the needs and the problems facing society. So it's making these connections and making sure that they're heard is important.
Thank you, Ronan. Sorry, I've kept you.
Sorry, that's okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Yeah. Hello, everyone. And thanks for all the organizers and the speakers. Hello again, John. Hope you're keeping well. Yeah, just kind of a few thoughts and kind of a response to kind of what Irvin was saying to begin with on like the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly essentially not being enacted. To sum up briefly, that's probably how and where I believe the greatest failure and betrayal of Irish activism has occurred to the people here and beyond in holding citizens' assemblies on climate. That might have been breakthrough in the beginning, in fairness to that, but the reason I feel so ashamed of what's been happening in Irish activism is because there has been a couple of people behind closed doors who've been actively blocking Citizens' Assembly on system change. And the reason I bring that up is because it doesn't matter how good the recommendations of a Citizens' Assembly are. And I think if you see many of the recommendations in any given Citizens' Assembly, a lot of them being as positive as they are and have a tendency of being, the most just and realistic recommendations that do arise from them fundamentally challenge capitalism. Therefore, they get ignored or rejected, not necessarily because the people involved in policy making are evil, but there are, I guess, the governors of neoliberalism who are elected to do what they are doing, which obviously is not okay. It has to end. Capitalism is horrible in every way, and has been to a lot of people much more so than others for a long, long time. But it essentially, a lot of my issue with this, and it kind of comes to, or in the spirit of respectful conflict, I think, and kind of touching on what Martha was saying earlier is, or in my feelings of the same, is that particularly in the global north, Marxist revolutionary theory, as opposed to maybe non-violent revolutionary theory, which I do believe are more at conflict than are synergistic. I believe many privileged, white, liberal people within the global north from better to do backgrounds, and certainly not just billionaires, and certainly not even millionaires, they opt for Marxist revolutionary theory because it defers the revolution onto the poor or worker rather than them having to do the brave and courageous revolutionary acts and campaigns themselves. And just as a critical example of that, I would say, like I engaged in a fast from foods and for 8 days and water for 1 day to highlight the many crimes of Irish universities, for example. But behind closed doors, it wasn't the farmers blocking that. It was a couple of people with names and addresses. And it's not to say like I'm a deep advocate for peace activism. All I'm trying to say is that the buck in Irish, in a liberal economy, a liberal capitalist economy, the buck of revolution stops within activism, which is why it essentially hasn't produced the goods, we'll say, of bringing an end to Irish capitalism. We'll say, there's a quote here. I'll try and paraphrase it as much as I can for brevity of time, not to be eaten up to too much spaces, but it's by an Argentinian activist, socialist by the name of Silvio Gazelle. You spent, I'll pop it in the chat here. Maybe that's the best thing to do because it's a little bit longer, but it's worth reading. It essentially, in my mind, sums up a lot of why this worker-led revolution, which they don't have to be excluded, but I believe a lot of people opt for this because they know deep down, not all of them, and don't get me wrong, any given Marxist, I'd agree with them on 30 to 85% of things, depending on the Marxist. But in my opinion, things are going to continue failing because of what I would call orthodox Marxism in liberal global north privileged white economies. So that mightn't come across as a question, but more a point I'd like to throw into the mix per se, that like this worker-led calling for more jobs, it lends itself exactly to the same problems that we're trying to end. Like, there's another good saying I'll throw in here from the book Sacred Economics, that capitalism failed because it couldn't tell the ecological truth. Socialism failed because it couldn't tell the economic truth. And for that reason, I believe non-violence of and upon universities is going to be critical, but not for, and this I believe is the crucial crux of the matter in the revolution, not for workers, for example, in universities to be getting more money from capitalism, as a lot of revolutionaries of the left, I'd say quote unquote, with playful antagonism as well, opt for this means as well, because I believe they believe, a lot of them, at least a lot of them, believe it's not going to work. It's asking for more of capitalism, and is blocking a university mobilization into all-out disobedience for system change to benefit everyone.
Ronan, sorry,
I'll
we're just
leave it there,
starting
yeah.
to run out of time,
Yeah.
so maybe we, John and
That's
Alexandra,
okay.
have
Thank you.
a quick thank you, quick chance to respond, and then we have to bring our session to the close because people probably have already next things planned. So John and Alexandra, I don't know if either of you wants to come in and respond to.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. Good to see you again, Roland. I mean, you've now asked a question that I didn't put up from Lenin, which is what is to be done? His famous 1905 tract, which is now still with us, and that's what you hit the nail on the head in terms of what are our strategies of change. It's probably the most important question, certainly in social science, if not in politics and discussion of these issues. How does change happen? How do we think change happens in society? And I do think, well, I made it very clear that I think the liberal democratic reformist path is certainly a failure. I do still think that we will need, and by, I don't think I was promoting a Marxist version of a revolution, if that's what you heard. I'm interested in what made you think that. But I do think there are lessons from recognizing that we're going to need the majority in society to come with us. I mean, that's in a way what the working class is. And that would include, those in the university sector who may be more privileged, but they're still under the dictates, as you quite rightly mentioned, of this extractivist ecocidal system. Our societies are going to need, I think, coalitions of the willing, and some strange coalitions, some of which I've kind of intimated at already, in localized areas where we may get elements of the students' movement, the trade union movement, community groups, faith communities coming together on a particular energy transition plan or a climate action plan, and so on. And I do certainly think we're going to need these new experiments in localized ways of responding to these global challenges. Well, of course, not saying that these cannot be disconnected. We're still going to need national and international agreements. I think the plain truth is, so just to finish on this, I don't think anyone knows what the correct form of a theory of transition is going to be, because as a species, never mind as societies, we've never had to face anything that we're facing now. These intersecting polycrises of the climate, ecological, the biodiversity crisis, deepening racial and class inequalities, the growing, division within our society between the extreme left and extreme right across Europe. And in all of that, I don't think there is any particular one form of a theory of social change, but we certainly need to be engaging and experimenting with them and seeing what does work, but while also being provisional and being willing to change and say, well, that didn't work, let's try something different. So I think it is about saying, well, what are our theories of change that we can throw on the table? Maybe what worked in the past is not going to work in the future, and what lessons, I would say, finally, that particularly we in the global north can learn from the global south, because I actually have more faith and hope of the types of changes that I want to see actually come up from the global south than I do from the global north.
Thank you. Alexandra, did you want to come in and conclude this?
Very briefly, I would just add that, while we're looking for change in the right direction and positive, I think it's also very important to say that, deliberative process, for example, can be very important in keeping the direction towards where we want it, whether that's very impactful or not, because there's a real danger that more entrenched positions, that take us backward, could happen, because of people reacting to change. So I think that's a really important thing, when we're talking about polarized societies, is that there is, I think, a real danger of moving backwards on this.
Yeah, it's a bit sad note to end on, but there we are. Here we've just arrived here. But there are some very interesting comments and also personal experiences also in the chat, which is going to be we can look at some of the recommendations in the chat later. And thank you very much to everybody. It's been very interesting and inspiring, and clearly we would have needed a whole day for this webinar. So hopefully within the next years of Shift, we can see you all in one form or another again. Also the John, maybe you can join us at some point again. A reminder to those who already know and to those who don't, there is a conference organized by Shift happening in Graz in September, from which we hope that various sort of publications might arise as well. So please keep an eye on Shift website. And thank you again. And I hope to see you all at some point later. So thanks. And we will post everything on Shift website as well. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.